Hello everyone, I'm aReNGee and I'd like to welcome you all back to our first Stock Talk in over 2 months. I know I say this at the start of a lot of my videos and all my other content, but I do have a lot of balls in the air, but the Stock Talk series is something that was universally well liked and it's something that I'd like to get back into. Now that I have some time and I've taken care of a couple of other issues like the stock lists, um, it's something that I'd like to spend a lot more time on and maybe start putting a bunch more of those out here. I've also decided to change the format of these stock talks. Rather than looking at the individual deck lists first and then bringing you a core, I'm going to start with the cards that are core to the archetype, then look at some of the tech choices to fill out the rest of the deck, and then I'm going to go look at what individual players have done with their deck lists in order to adapt them for the metagame that they were expecting. So for today, we're going to be looking at Combrei Aggro, or aggressive Combrei, or whatever else you want to call it. It's the time justice deck that wants to hit you in the face and keep hitting you until you fall over. So we've got our core list here, and the core list across all of the deck lists that I looked at was 69 cards, including almost all of the power. Almost every player ran 25 power, and most of the units were the same, and most of them were 4-ofs. Now you'll see some red numbers in there. Yes, I don't have all of the Combrei legendaries, or even some of the rares. It wasn't something that I have been playing a lot of, but a lot of people have, and this is what they've been able to come up with. The core of the deck starts with 4 Initiate of the Sands. This is an aggressive deck, so it wants to get out and play its units as quickly as possible. The deck plays a lot of 2-drops, and this doesn't have a ton of synergy with that, since you still need to play that 2-drop even if you have 3 power available, but it helps it push out its powerful 3s and 4s faster. Playing Siraf, Sandstorm Titan, or Copperhall Elite a turn faster can definitely be the difference between winning and losing when Harsh rules all the way up on 5, and there aren't a lot of units that can brawl with those too well before that. After the Initiate, we've got the powerful 1-2 punch of Awakened Student and Crownwatch Paladin. Crownwatch Paladin is probably the weakest unit in the deck on its own, but it holds Vodakhan staff really well. As a 5/5 Paladin is nearly impossible to answer with a single card on turn 3. An Awakened Student is a powerful multi-faction threat, which is important because it means it dodges Annihilate on 2. And it can grow throughout the game to become a very powerful unit, especially if it's picked up any Warcry buffs along the way. That just helps push it up there. Also in the 2-drop, we see 4 copies of Desert Marshal, which is kind of a must-include card in Combrei at the moment. Just the ambush speed silence proves too useful for players to ignore, and there's a lot of tricks you can do with it in this deck particularly. You can ambush it out end of turn just as a unit, suit it up with a Vodakhan staff, and off you go. Also in the 2 slot, we have our first interesting card, and it's interesting because this card is included across all the decks when previously it wasn't, and that card is Teleport. Teleport is a card that some people like, some people don't. It's strictly card disadvantage in that it doesn't actually deal with any threats permanently, but it's a very strong tempo card. If your opponent plays something for 5 or 6 power and you're able to use 2 power end of turn to teleport it back to their hand and crash in there, well, you've wasted their entire turn for just 2 power of yours, and you're able to still cast stuff on your turn to keep going. So it causes huge tempo swings, can cause blowouts in response to pump spells or double blocks, and it can even save your units to reuse them. If your opponent points a removal spell at your Sandstorm Titan, you can teleport it back to your hand and replay it. So there's a lot of versatility in play to the card, and I think it's really cool that this has sort of come into the mainstream of Combrei Aggro decks because it makes them a lot more of it gives them a lot more play. There's a lot more that you can do when you've got an interactive card like this rather than just slapping down all your units and hoping it carries the day. Another interesting inclusion, although not a surprising one, is Vanquish. What's interesting to me is that they're playing the full 4 copies. This to me says that Combrei Aggro decks are having a lot of trouble with being stalled by a single large unit, and that's where the teleports and vanquishes come in, because they really want to push through and keep on attacking. In other decks, I haven't ever been wanting to play more than 3 copies of Vanquish in the main. Me personally, because I found I always flooded out with them against low curve decks where Vanquish just had no targets at all. You never really wanted to draw 2 copies against, say, Stone Scarred Jito or something like, or a different tokens deck, something like that. So I think it's interesting that they're able to find the full 4 copies, and I assume that's just because the deck has such large units initially that it doesn't really care. If its Vanquish doesn't have any targets, that's good because its units can attack. And if its Vanquish has targets, well, it can push through with its units afterwards. In the 3 slot, we see Siraf, which is an obvious inclusion in this kind of deck. A 3/4 Overwhelm for 3 is a welcome body, and just having the late game insurance of that ability is pretty nice, although Combrei Aggro decks would of course prefer that the game doesn't go that far. Players were a little bit split on whether they play 2 copies or 3 copies of Stand Together. It depends on how much harsh rule you'd be expecting in the metagame. I think at the moment 2 copies is better, and that's what the majority of players have played, so that's what I've included in the stock list. If you yourself find you'd like 3 copies, go with that. 4 copies of Valkyrie Enforcer were a standard inclusion as well. Same as the Desert Marshal, silence allows them to push past problematic units like Statuary Maiden, Steward of the Past, other deadly guys. If anybody's playing Dawnwalker, you can prevent those from coming back, although since Dawnwalker comes back exhausted, it's not that much of a problem for aggro decks anymore. Vodakhan's Staff is your sole remaining unit at 3. Older versions of this deck before patch 1.14 would play both Vodakhan Staff and Gilded Glaive, but with Gilded Glaive receiving some pretty heavy nerfs, Vodakhan Staff is the only one that survives, just as a 3-cost weapon that gives +3/+3 that can come back. It's only a little bit better than a Crownwatch Longsword, but it's the fact that it comes back once you hit 8 power means that these decks have some sort of long game recursion plan and can pile these onto an Overwhelm unit or a flyer and push through for the last few points of damage. Acts as pseudo burn, works really well with all the various Aegis units, and just it's like a permanent finest hour is the best way that I would say it. It helps you push your big guys through their big guys. Up in the 4 slot, we have the must include in time deck Sandstorm Titan, which I'm sure many of you will agree needs no explanation, and 4 copies of Copperhall Elite. Copperhall Elite synergizes really well with this deck is trying to do. It's not the biggest at a 4/4 for 4, but Aegis and Overwhelm help keep it safe and push it through. It's another good holder of Vodakhan's Staff, receiver of any Warcry buffs you may have, that sort of thing. And it's pretty good at threatening control opponents with its Aegis. 25 powers was the gold standard, and for whatever reason, people are playing this weird combination where you play 2 diplomatic seals and a 7/8 split of sigils in addition to the banners and seats of progress. I don't mind this split. I think it's okay. You do want double justice and double time for Valkyrie Enforcer and Sandstorm Titan. So it makes some amount of sense that they're not playing the full 4 diplomatic seals, but diplomatic seal is usually a 4 of or a 0 of kind of card. So I think you could pretty easily go up to 4 diplomatic seals and not have too much trouble. But personally, I haven't played the deck all that much, so trust in their power base for the moment. 25 power is definitely the gold standard that you want to stick to. Some players played up to 27, but their power base was the same as this with the inclusion of just amber monuments as additional late game cards. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the tech choices that you have for Combrei Aggro. As you can see, this is only 26 out of 75 cards, so you still have 6 more cards to choose that are totally your own. Here's what Combrei Aggro players were taking a look at. Excuse me. The new standard 1-drop in, the runner-up at the Eternal Tournament Series, Iliac, was playing 4 copies of District Infantry in his deck as a additional aggressive 1-drop. This came over from JPEG's list that he's been playing. So JPEG and Iliac are number 1 and number 2 on ladder at the moment. Whichever one's number 1 changes moment to moment, but They pass a bunch of technology back and forth, and this is JPEG's innovation. He's been playing District Infantry as another low-cost guy. Helps you start the beats early, put your opponent on the back foot even sooner, and gives you another one drop to play that isn't an issue in his hands. The downside is this guy's not as much of a good top deck later in the game, so you really do need to play him on turn one to make him useful, and then you need those empower drops to keep on hitting. But he can help you get out to an aggressive start if that's what you're looking for, and there are some matchups where Combrei Aggro really needs these aggressive starts in order to shine. So if you're looking for a more aggressive take on the deck, then 4 copies of him are definitely recommended. However, this card is definitely a 4 of or a 0 of kind of card. If you're going down that route, you want all of him. Otherwise, don't touch him. Some players played copies of Inspire to fill out their curve. It gives you another thing to play on turn one, helps you find stuff. All the units in the deck play really well with +1/+1 buffs. You know, Crownwatch Paladin gets more threatening. Sandstorm Titan just gets even fatter. All the Overwhelm units appreciate it. It's really good on the Aegis and Overwhelm ones, but everything likes to get +1/+1, and it helps make sure that you fill out your deck size without adding in cards that you don't want. So if you'd like to stay with a more, core Combrei Aggro kind of strategy, but you're not too sure what to fill out, Inspire is always a fine choice, even if it's not always a tech card per se, sort of more of a filler card. It does work pretty well with the deck, so if you're not sure what to put in, Inspire is fine, and you can put any number of copies of this. 1 copy, 2 copy, 4 copies, it'll be okay. Some players played copies of Protect, as I've talked about earlier and Unearthly has noted. Spot removal is kind of at a minimum at the moment. So Protect is, you don't want to be playing too many copies of this. You either want 1 or 2 copies to protect your various units. Again, a lot of your units already have Aegis or or very large, tough to kill, can't be hit by Annihilate and Suffocate kind of deal. So, and you've already got the stand togethers to deal with the mass removal. So Protect is only there if you're playing against a whole lot of spot removal decks, Permafrosts, Death Strikes, that sort of thing, and you're looking for big blowouts. I personally wouldn't go over 1 copy. Some players are playing 2. That's up to you. It's just an additional defensive inclusion if you want to be playing that kind of game and you find yourself running into those kinds of cards. Finest Hour is sort of a card that's been brought over from the Recano aggro decks in order to beat the Combrei decks, and it's been put into Combrei to help them push through the mirror. Much like Vodakhan's staff, this gives you the +3/+3 that you need to turn just about any unit combat in your favor. So you can put this on your Sandstorm Titan, push through their Sandstorm Titan. You can blow out a double block on your Copperhall Elite by putting this on and pushing through for damage. There's a lot that you can do with Finest Hour. It also blocks Torch, which is very important, and can also negate Suffocate. So 2 cards that are very popular against Combrei Aggro. It can deal with them in the same way as Protect, but have additional uses outside of that. Now, nobody was playing more than 2 or 3 copies. I don't think this is a 4 of card, but I definitely think that if you're looking for a spicy 1 of, Finest Hour is the first place that I would look. There's a lot that you can do with it. It's very cheap, so it's not a big commitment to keep up. And this has the additional bonus that you can play this on opponents' units to pop off an Aegis or something if you're trying to get a Vanquish through, which is that's a whole lot of utility for a card that's primary purpose is to win unit combat. It's got a lot of uses outside of that too. So it's a strong card. If you're going down the Finest Hour route, I think 2 is a good place to start. And then depending on how it performs, you go up to 3. You go up to 3 or down to 1. The rest of these cards, well, interesting, you'll see a big split in between the cards, as the top 4 lines are all 1-drops, although not all of them are intended to be played on turn 1, and they're all Justice. Whereas at the other end, we have 4-drops, and they're all time-based. Time doesn't have a ton of good early game cards to play. Some people were playing, what's the card? Temple Scribe, but I don't think that's particularly good in this deck, since it requires a heavy time commitment very early on, which isn't something that you want to do since all your best units are time and justice. And while it filters through the deck, it doesn't really affect the board in any way, and it's better as a blocker than an attacker. Conversely, these high-end cards give you a lot more play than the standard Sandstorm Titan, and Copperhall Elite, since there's a lot more that you can do with them. But you do risk overwhelming on 4-drops if you play a whole bunch of these cards. So usually people played 2 copies at most, and if you're playing more, you're going to need to start cutting Copperhall Elites or Sandstorm Titans to avoid overloading, or play more Sigils so that you have the power to actually sustain all these 4s. Praxis Displacer works much in the same way as Teleport, but is a more aggressive version of it. Since you're only able to play it on your turn, you don't really get a lot of the defensive options that Teleport gives you. You can't really use it on your own units to save them from removal spells, although you can bounce Permafrost off them, so to speak, by bouncing them back to your hand. And it's really good at clearing the way for blockers while developing onto the board. This card in particular plays really well with another card on the list, Xenon Obelisk, because just a 3/2 for 4 really isn't that impressive a body. On the other hand, this card is very good at winning Rakano games, as Rakano decks like to overload a single unit with weapons, and bouncing that unit back to their hand will reset the weapons. It's not great against Warcry buffs since the Warcry buffs stick around, but against weapons specifically, Praxis Displacer is quite a good tech card. If you're finding that you have trouble with spread or go wide decks, Marathon's Disciple can be a good choice. It is 5 attack and 5 strength and 5 health for 4 power, which is pretty good when you play the Sandcrawler. So it's not bad on its own. And when you're looking for something specific, maybe you want a Scorpion to stall out the board or a Locust to attack through in the air, Marathon's Disciple definitely supplies it. It's also another card that's very good with Xenon Obelisk, since it gives you 2 bodies to make use of the buff. But Marathon's Disciple is more of a hedge your bets kind of card rather than any of the other cards on this list. It's just something that's going to be generally useful in a lot of different matchups, but it's never going to be the optimal card for the job. It's sort of a generalist tech card if you're not sure what to put in. Putting in Marathon's Disciple, you can't really go wrong. Xenon Obelisk is quite a powerful card, and as I've mentioned, it combos with a lot of the higher end 4s, but you can't overload on 4s, and drawing this card on its own is kind of miserable, as it costs a lot to play and it doesn't immediately affect the board unless you already have units in play. If you have 3 units in play, this is a very powerful play, since it gives them +1/+1, and if you ever get up to 8 power, it's great. But unlike the sort of Shimmer Pack token style decks, you're not going to have as many units in play, and this is more of a go tall deck than a go wide. Even though you do have the stand together to protect against harsh rule, you're usually using that on about 2 or 3 units, not 5 or 6. So Xenon Obelisk was a very common one of, as if it sticks around and you get to that 8 power, it is a good mirror breaker and helps you push through those last points of damage. But it's not a very common 4 of. I wouldn't play this as a 4 of, and not even a 2 of. So if you're going to play the more Marathon's Disciple route, you might, maybe you switch out the Copperhall Elites, or you don't have Sandstorm Titans, so you swap in Marathon's Disciples. Then going the Xenon, 2 Xenon Obelisks makes a fair amount of sense. But if you're sticking mostly with the core list, Xenon Obelisk is probably not more than a 1 of. The final tech choice that people use that was pretty popular is anybody who was playing more than 25 sigils was generally playing Amber Monuments as their top end. Amber Monuments just gave them a little bit of additional color or influence fixing, and that you get a bit more time influence so you can get those Sandstorm Titans down. But also, if the game happens to go long and you draw them, they turn into 5/5 overwhelms for 5, which is not a bad rate. It's pretty close to being constructed, or to being good and constructed, and it's certainly reasonable when you want a body that also does a good power impression. So if you're going to go over 25 powers, definitely play the Amber Monuments rather than anything else. Don't be playing 27 powers with 4 diplomatic seals. That's just not the way to go. All right. So now we've looked at the original core list of 69 cards for Combrei Aggro, and we've looked at some of the tech choices that you can slot in order to adapt this deck to your own personal needs. Now let's take a look at 2 top players whose names you should know very well by now, and see what they've been doing with the Combrei Aggro list. We're going to start off with Neon. who has been playing Combrei Aggro for a couple weeks now, been liking it, although I must admit that he says the Shimmer pack is busted and he swapped over to that for the moment. We'll see if he comes back. This is his list here that we're looking at. It's including a bunch of the tech cards that we talked about, the Finest Hour, the Inspire, the Protect. And he's playing a couple of, and he's also playing the Amber Monuments to go with his 27 power. Neon's definitely the player that plays the most power in Combrei Aggro. Most of the other players play 26 at the most. But he is playing the 2 Amber Monuments and the weird 2 Diplomatic Seal split. The other interesting things that he's doing is he's only playing a single copy of Teleport, which makes sense when you consider how many other fast spells he's put in between the Protects, the Finest Hours, and the Stand Togethers that were already in the deck. You can't overload on spells, you run out of units, so he's probably playing fewer of those because he's playing so many other tech cards that are spells rather than units. He's also only playing 3 copies of Vodakhan Staff, probably because he's got the 2 copies of Finest Hour. So he's adapted his deck to be more of a focused aggressive deck. You know, the units are there on their own merits. They're not really there to be buffed up. There's no obelisk and not too many Vodakhan staffs to put them on. So you play the units out and then you use your various spells in order to push them through and improve them, rather than relying on a more 2-for-1 based, or a strategy that opens you to more 2-for-1s by stacking on weapons, or playing lots of obelisks is pretty slow. So he's more of the unit focused deck, where he's going to carry you through in the mid game with a key trick or 2 rather than starting yourself out too aggressively. He's got 3 Inspires to buff up his units sort of incidentally while he's drawing through his deck, and the Singleton Protect to protect any units that do get too big. Again, whenever you're putting in tech cards, it's important to think about what you're putting in and what sort of trade-offs you're making. Here you can see that Neon has made the trade-off of fewer weapons and less teleports in favor of his more spell-based tech plan. Whereas if we look at another player and our Eternal Tournament Series runner-up last weekend, Iliac, he's playing a much more unit-based plan. He's got those 4 copies of District Infantry that we talked about earlier, showing that he's really going for a early start, and he's not playing any cute cards down in the 1. We don't have any Protects, we don't have any Finest Hours, we don't have any Inspires, nothing like that. Just, he wants to curve out on units. He's playing more copies of Stand Together than just about anybody else is. He's playing the full 3, which makes sense when you consider that he's playing 36 units rather than 32 or 30 or anything like that. And he's got 4 copies of Vodakhan Staff to buff him up, along with the Singleton Xenon Obelisk at the top of the curve. Rather than Neon's more mid-range based spell-heavy Combrei Aggro, Iliac has gone with a very unit-heavy version where he likes to spread out the board with as many units as possible and just smash his opponent down by buffing him up. It's simple. It doesn't have a ton of excess interaction beyond the teleports and vanquishes and silences, which is already a bunch of interaction, I must admit. So nothing fancy going on in the interaction front, but he's playing a whole bunch of units that are very good at being aggressive, and he's playing a bunch of top end that buffs those up. So we have 2 competing styles here. We've got Iliac's more unit-based, and we've got Neon's more finicky spell-based combo, and which show 2 fairly different ways to play Combrei Aggro, even though these cards are only about 6 or 7 cards. Even though these lists are only about 6 or 7 cards different. You'll notice that Iliac's not playing any of the Amber Monuments. He's going down to the 25 power, so he wants as streamlined an aggro deck as possible. Whereas Neon just wants, as many different lines of play as he can. He wants as many different things he can have access to as possible. 2 different philosophies, same deck. All kinds of different ways that you can customize it. So, there we have our Combrei Aggro stock talk. This is a bit of a weaker stock talk than a lot of the others, I'm sure, because I'm fairly out of practice in doing these, and this isn't actually a deck that I've been playing myself very often. As you can see, I don't even have most of the cards for it. but it's something that I've played in the past and I'm fairly familiar with, so I'm quite confident that, everything that I've said has been correct. Just I'm not able to go too in depth on a lot of the nuances of win rates for 3 stand-togethers versus 2 and that sort of thing. I hope you enjoyed this stock talk, as it's something I'd like to get back into doing a lot of as people look for the optimal lists for a lot of these things. And please let me know what elements of the Stock Talk series you really liked and what elements you think could be good. For this particular one, I didn't offer you an exact 75 card list for a stock deck that I thought was optimal, giving you rather the 69 card core list and then offering you a bunch of tech cards to choose from. Would you guys prefer in the future that I give you the full 75 in addition to these, instead of these? What works best for you? This has been aReNGee, and this has been our first Stock Talk in a long time. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you all.